أهلا وسهلا بكم مجددا في المركز العربي للأبحاث ودراسة السياسات. هذه الفعالية الثانية اليوم معنا الدكتورة ليزا أندرسون.
دكتور ليزا أندرسون، ويسعدني أن أعرفكم بها البروفيسورة أندرسون.
Lecturer and James Shotwell Professor Emerita of International Relations at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Anderson served as president of the American University of Cairo from 2011 until 2016, serving before then as provost as well. She's Dean Emerita of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, where she led the school from 1997 until 2007. She was on the faculty of Columbia since 1986, where she served as chair of the Department of Political Science and was director of Columbia's Middle East Institute. Dr. Anderson's scholarly research has included work on state formation in the Middle East and North Africa, on regime change and democratization in developing countries, and on social science in general, academic research and public policy, both in the United States and around the world. Among her books are The State and Social Transformation in Tunisia and Libya, 1830-1980, that was published in 1986, and Pursuing Truth, Exercising Power, Social Science and Public Policy in the 21st Century, published in 2003. Professor Anderson's talk today is The Financialization of Everything, Revisiting Capital and Coercion in the Middle East. I have a note here that I want to make sure that you know not only political scientists claim Dr. Anderson, historians claim her too. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It is a delight to be here. By way of background, this lecture is part of a series of explorations of what the modern state, particularly in the global south, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, looks like in the 21st century. So it's exploratory and somewhat tentative, but I hope you find it provocative, and I look forward to your responses. A number of people here in the audience have pushed and pulled me in this conversation about the state, and I'm very grateful to the Doha Institute and the Arab Center for continuing the conversation on the nature of the state, the health of social science, and the relationship between how we understand each and both of them. Finally, today is my birthday, and this is my birthday party. Okay, so I start, as I say, by way of background, describing a little bit of a project that I'm sort of in the midst of on this question about what the contemporary state looks like. And I argue in that project, for which this is a sort of expansion, that what we call the modern state everywhere, and now particularly in the global south, was a device for organizing political authority that was exported from Europe into the rest of the world in fits and starts over the several centuries that followed its appearance in Europe, sort of in a stylized way in the Peace of Westphalia. It reached its apogee in the United Nations' patently fictitious but politically powerful principle of the sovereignty of all members, whose criteria for membership are that the applicant be a peace-loving state, able and willing to carry out the obligations contained in the Charter. Obviously, many members of the United Nations are not peace-loving, nor able or willing to carry out things like promoting universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So we have a mechanism here that is the organizational principle for the world, and yet we know perfectly well that it's not actually working according to the organizational principles. So this is part of what I'm trying to explore. This earlier effort that I just referred to tried to challenge the primacy of this state as understood by contemporary social scientists and to historicize its exercise of political authority in the region by examining 3 eras of contestation about, over, and beyond the polity in the Arab world. And I argue that in the first decades of independence, the principal focus of contention in the Arab world was definition and control of the states bequeathed the region by imperialism. So it was, what are the appropriate states? How do we build them? How do they interact with each other? That period lasted, I will argue, into the 1970s, whereupon the latter quarter of the 20th century, the emphasis shifted from addressing the legacy of the past, that is, we had these things imposed in the region, what do we do with them, to preserving the present, that is, to stability represented by regime longevity. So rather than debate any longer whether these were the appropriate polities in the region, people turned to making sure that they actually were stable. And by the time of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, the international investment in stability was being abandoned in favor of regime change, often framed as democracy promotion. And the uprisings of the Arab Spring less than a decade later sealed the fate of many of the regimes that had based their rule on longevity and familiarity. So the question is, what followed? And this actually is a question that's come up in several of our discussions of this weekend. What has happened since that Arab Spring? So what I'm going to argue followed the demise of the regimes as the locus of authority, represented the culmination of decades of neoliberal enthusiasm for the market and its putative promise of a prosperous future. The business enterprise now supplements and increasingly supplants both the state and regime as the unit of political authority and the standard of political aspiration. This turn to the market, which was encouraged internationally and embraced by governments across the region, reflected a dramatic reformulation of the principles and norms of human rights and citizens, never widely embraced in the region, even when the ideologies of states and regimes prevailed, and it has redefined the relationship of rulers and ruled. As the ruler of Dubai wrote recently, today's leaders are not the same as yesterday's. Today's leaders are the silent giants who possess money, not the politicians who make noise. The babble of politics and its messy entanglements are of little benefit to us in the Arab world. So the logic of the newly emerging regional dynamic, I am arguing, was born in the neoliberal foundations of globalization and presented an opportunity to reframe political authority by bypassing states and regimes, the babble of politics, for an entirely new notion of governance modeled on the modern multinational corporation. Again, the ruler of Dubai, himself a prominent advocate of this approach, has argued, maybe the time has come for the GCC Council or the Arab League to be overseen by leaders, managers, businessmen, heads of industry, and entrepreneurs instead of foreign ministers. Now, the ruling families of the Gulf are among the most eager proponents of the retreat of the state and the restructuring of regimes, as they've adopted the watchwords of the global private sector, positioning themselves as nimble, entrepreneurial, innovative, and they characterize themselves less as stewards of states or members of political regimes than as the management committees of family-owned businesses. The mobilization of cross-border networks of alliance and competition often worked at cross purposes with state imperatives while cementing economic networks. So that's the argument that this presentation is designed to deepen, if you will. So having broached the idea that the project on the purpose of rule has changed from state formation to regime stability to creating value, I want to explore further the causes and effects of this focus on prosperity as a value, and particularly on finance. Now, as I will suggest, most of the literature on economic development accents the real economy, accents production and trade in goods and services. One of the things that I'm arguing, actually, is that finance has become both actually important in the world economy and part of the way we are changing how not only we think about political economy, but how these kinds of regimes think about their responsibilities, their opportunities, their relationship with the people within the polity, not necessarily understood as citizens. So the starting point here is to go back to an old classic, a relatively old classic, on the development of states in Europe. And that is Tilley's magisterial collection, book, Coercion, Capital, and European States. So he argues that the way we understand the development of European states is to look at how they mobilized a coercive apparatus to ensure control of territory in Europe, but how they also paid for that. So you have to mobilize coercion, but you also have to mobilize capital. And so various combinations of capital and coercion account for the various trajectories that produced what he would call the nation state that we understood as the model for politics by the time you get to the mid-20th century. So they were different trajectories, and part of his contribution was to say not all European states evolved in the same sort of way, but in essence, they all ended up looking quite a lot alike. So as he put it, so I want to talk about coercion and capital and then get to how this has anything to do with, because he mentions, he insists on the limitations of his own work to Europe, to which I will momentarily return. But what does he mean by coercion? And in that sense, what do I mean by coercion? So it's ultimately the development of the standing armies that permitted rulers to exercise the monopoly of the legitimate use of force with which we associate the modern state. That expression, of course, is Weber's, but for all intents and purposes, Tilley accepts that and says, okay, you have these territories and you have to be able to control them. So he defines coercion. I'm not going to read it for you. And then he talks about the accumulation and concentration of coercive means. And so that happened over the course of time in Europe, and as I suggested, was reformulated and adapted elsewhere. So in order to pay for that coercion, you have to have capital. And again, I'm borrowing from Tilley. So he says it's any tangible mobile resources, enforceable claims on such resources. Now, what's really interesting here, and this is completely an aside, Tilley probably, he certainly doesn't develop it in the book, and I don't think he developed it subsequently or anywhere else. And for what it's worth, Tilley and I were neighbors in the same apartment building. So I think I can say this with some authority. He makes this little noticed distinction between capitalists as merchants, entrepreneurs, and financiers, rather than as owners of the means of production. He says they became the owners of means of production later, and that much of the European experience was actually a world of finance, not a world of capitalist production. In any event, this is how he describes the sort of building blocks of this modern state. And today, I will argue, the primacy of finance as the engine of capitalist growth seems to be reasserting itself. And this is part of my argument about what the world looks like now. But for the purposes of understanding what the relationship between this and the development of states, this is how the Europeans paid for their armies. So the extraction of resources to pay for the means of domination was the original dynamic of state formation in Europe. And it was the system that fueled the imperial expansion, culminating in the export of the state around the world. Now, one of the things that I think is important is that even Tilly, and certainly most of his successors, assume that the realms of exploitation and coercion were limited to what we would now call the domestic scene in Europe. That, I think, is mistaken. I think what imperialism was with the expansion of the regime of domination and exploitation around the world, but for our purposes, the two mechanisms were how the European states were built. So the top map, for what it's worth, is a map of imperial territories around 1914. And the bottom map is a map of the members of the United Nations. The idea I'm trying to convey here is that by the time you get to the United Nations, you have this system of sort of formal equal sovereignty sitting on top of and, sort of assuming but not really admitting the first map. That is to say, these were very, very different trajectories, and then suddenly we said everybody was equal and everybody was the same. And this notion of a state, as it was exported through this European system in the sort of institutionalized in the first instance in the League of Nations and then obviously in the United Nations, this system assumes sovereign equality, but as we know, states vary a great deal. So even Tilly knew that. Even in 1992, when he published the book, he knew that. So he talked about what he called third world state formation. And he says it is fundamentally and necessarily different from what happened in Europe. And that's in large part because of the way, as he would argue, the way coercion was mobilized in imperial possessions. So he speculates about the causes and consequences of those differences, especially for what, as I say, was known as the Third World. That's what he called it. What one might think as the non-aligned, developing, post-colonial global South. So the question is, what distinguishes state formation from his point of view, and to what extent is he missing anything? So he argues that what happened is that because these states, these formally equal states, did not have the capacity to expand their territorial domains, the music had stopped, the borders were there, the purposes of coercion changed, and for the countries of the Third World, they, having been prevented from using the coercive apparatus for expansion, as their European predecessors had, so they were neither offensive nor defensive purposes, they turned inward, as it were, and focused on domestic domination. And this, says Tilly, is why they never were they never had to seriously negotiate with civilian rulers. So he has a story in Europe about how the civilians could control the military apparatus. He says that possibility was no longer available to countries outside of Europe because the coercive apparatus had nothing to do, could not be sent off to wage wars, ended up being used as a mechanism for domestic domination. So he thinks he's explained the character of the regimes in much of the global South, the emphasis on domestic repression and the emphasis or the appearance of these military regimes around the region, or around the world, actually. And obviously, as you can see, the picture that I selected to illustrate this are the rulers of Libya, Sudan, Syria, and Egypt as cases in point. So military men became involved in the struggles for state power. So then he says, let's look at how that worked and so forth and so on. My question to Tilly, were he here, is what of capital? He doesn't really talk about this. When he says the development of the state in the Third World is profoundly different from Europe, he says that's because of the differences in the role of coercion. But he doesn't really say very much about capital. He's oddly silent on whether it's changed, mentioning only in passing what I have highlighted here, the internationalization of capital, the rise of corporations whose capital is everywhere and nowhere. So this is in his list en passant of other things that had changed that might have some impact on the character of state formation and state building in the third world. So what I want to do is bring capital back in, is begin to think systematically about how that might matter. So I've, for all intents and purposes, accepted a Tillian version of European history and accepted his argument for the sake of argument about coercion, and now want to say, being able to mobilize resources to pay these military establishments is also presumably important, also presumably somewhat different than the European patterns we expect. So the fact that Tilly is a little bit neglectful of this aspect is disappointing, but it provides the challenge that I want to take up here with you. And I want to accent, as Tilly did, not the ownership of the means of production, but actually the merchants, financiers, entrepreneurs, and encompass in their role a new or revived financialization. So here I'm going to move away from Tilly to discuss what I mean by financialization and what that seems to be, how it seems to capture something that's changed in the world, actually since the 1970s in serious ways. So we talk about the neoliberal magic of the marketplace and so forth and so on. That language and rhetoric and so forth should be familiar to you. This is a version of that, if you will. So it's relatively recent, this financialization. It's relatively recent. It has a history. It starts with this magic of the marketplace. It has a little bit of a prehistory that I'll get to in a minute. The neoliberal ideological revolution and its expansion in globalization, the technological innovations that have permitted us to be thinking about finance in a different sort of way. So fintech is all of the technology of mobile banking and so forth and so on. That means you can move money around all over the world very easily, mobile banking being, in a sense, the least of it. You can't do, the fancy financial engineering of the world without the algorithms that permit you to not only move money, but trade and swap credits and collateralize debt and so forth and so on. So all of that is embedded in some of the technological innovation that we're familiar with when we think about our phones. Then you get the 2008 financial crisis. That should give you some sense of the breadth and depth of financialization. It also should give you some sense of how difficult it is for any regulatory regime within or beyond states to manage the complexity of this financialization. Because much of the post-financial crisis development has been a response to the inability of regimes, both within the global north and everywhere else, to actually figure out a regulatory regime. So we're right now in the middle of yet another prospective financial crisis because we don't really know what to do. But what's interesting to me as an academic, and here we go very briefly to the development of social sciences, is that there has been in the last decade or so the development of financialization studies. So I was very happy to discover that because this question of how to think systematically about these changes, which I don't think are captured in political science, I don't think they're captured in political economy, I don't think they're captured except in sort of heterodox economics, people are beginning to think systematically about what this is. And as I say, it's trying to think about finance not merely as a mechanism by which owners of means of production get financing for things, but as something sort of independent of that at this point. And to think about how it affects much of our life without our really being self-conscious about it. So a lot of us think about the impact of technology on things like surveillance and the experience of convenience and so forth and so on. Less do we think about its impact as soaking into realms of financialization, as soaking into realms of our lives that we are not as necessarily alert to. So I want to talk a little bit about that, partly to make my case that this is an important leg for political analysis. The financialization studies world is sort of just like critical security studies. It is a response to a reigning paradigm in conventional macroeconomics and finance. It's critical about how we understand the actors in the domain and how they behave. So I think it's useful to provide a couple of examples of the kinds of things that are encompassed in financialization that we sometimes recognize and sometimes don't. So if any of you have ever run anything in the last 20 years, or 15 years, you've had to do a risk matrix. This idea of risk has become pervasive. And so you think about, we all have to calculate our risks. Well, that comes originally from insurance, which developed particularly in the 1950s. That's what I mean. There's a history to much of this that actually predates the neoliberal turn and was permitted the neoliberal term. So you get, instead of regulation, you have insurance. And once you have insurance and you can use that as then you can start saying, we don't need to be regulated. We'll insure our own risk and so forth and so on. State don't have to protect me from myself. I'm going to be entrepreneurial and so forth. That idea of risk management. And you may think that this is really still something that's only in the private sector, but it's not. So my favorite, of course, is risk management at universities, because I've done the risk matrix for universities. And universities, it's become pervasive. And it's not simply the financial side, we're going to be spending money and who's going to give us money and are we going to be able to balance our budget and stuff. The thing I like about this is that the list of risks are Harvard University's lists of risks, and they include academic risks. What's an academic risk? Everybody in this room is taking one right now. But that's what's interesting, is you begin to have a frame by which you understand what you're doing that is very foreign to the enterprise itself. We're not here because we're calculating the risks of. So this is actually academic risk. I tried to figure it out what Harvard meant by this. And it means the chances that the students don't succeed. Anyway, that's part of the pervasiveness of this way of thinking about these enterprises. So another one that I like quite a lot, because I'm sure you've heard about it, is the value of financial inclusion. So do you know how many people in the world are not banked? Do you know what banked is? Banked means you have a bank account. And somewhere between a quarter and a third of people in the world don't have a bank account. Well, if you would hear the bankers tell you this is a terrible thing, this means that they're not actually, incorporated into modern society and accessible and all, what it means is it's harder to lend to them. Which means what financial inclusion is, in many ways, is expanding debt. So it's a part of, yes, it's useful to have a bank account because then you can do electronic transfers, and then you're visible, and then you can borrow, And all of a sudden, the logic of financial inclusion looks very different from this sort of, this is how you do economic development now. So what I'm trying to suggest is that a lot of the things that we think are part of economic development and part of incorporating populations into social life and so forth and so on is actually about making money. So it's the international push, which is the UN thinks everybody should be banked, the World Bank thinks everybody should be banked, every single bank in the world thinks everybody should be banked, is obviously a vehicle for surveillance, because if you have a bank account, people can see it. But it's business opportunities for bankers and for financial literacy curricula developers, because once you have a bank account, you're going to get in trouble borrowing too much unless you have financial literacy. So now we're going to have the financial literacy industry. And this is back to the fintech. All of the mobile banking that you hear about is particularly important in sub-Saharan Africa is actually part of this capacity to spread networks of debt and provide liquidity for banks. So that's another part of the financialization. All right, finally, well, not finally, but this is sort of a joke. You can actually financialize yourself if you want to. So instead of borrowing money to travel, this guy tokenized himself and sold the equivalent of shares, so that if you bought a piece of his future, he could then travel and go to school and so forth and so on. So it was a gimmick, but it was really interesting as a gimmick because rather than borrow money from a friend or a family, he turned himself into something that was an asset. And then he sold shares in this asset. And it was written up, I found it, by somebody who admired that sort of inventiveness, agility, entrepreneurial spirit quite a lot. So, this is a real person. I found the real picture of him if you want to pursue his. But more and more of the world is being financialized, allowing people to invest not only in companies and government bonds, but art and collectibles, and now you can invest in young people. Not metaphorically, but actually. All right, so now I'm going to turn back to the kinds of things that I want to talk about in terms of the character of states and so forth, which is sovereign wealth funds is another reflection of financialization. And the growth of sovereign wealth funds, they were really developed again in the earliest ones from the 1950s. The Kuwait Fund for Future Generations was a very early development of a sovereign wealth fund. They've proliferated, as you can see, quite dramatically. So even countries that you wouldn't think could afford to have a sovereign wealth fund, like Egypt, has a very big and important sovereign wealth fund, in fact. So of the top 50 sovereign wealth funds in the world, 12 are in the Middle East and North Africa. And the way they operate historically, so if you look at the early sovereign wealth funds, Kuwait, Norway, places like that, they were very conservative. They would basically invest in things like U.S. treasuries, which are deemed a very conservative investment, very reliable. You're not going to get that much of a return, but you're going to get it. You don't have to worry about the investment going bad. Now, and this is from this list of Saudi Arabia's public investment funds, U.S. stock portfolio, I think last year. But now you're making investments as if you're a private investor. So, Disney's a good investment. Some oil companies are obviously, so is Starbucks. Starbucks is making money. If you invest in Starbucks, you'll make money. One of the things we don't realize is the extent to which things that we use ordinarily on a daily basis or think about, who watches Disney movies and so forth and so on, are actually the investors, in this instance, is the Saudi Public Investment Fund. So it's gotten very complicated, and it's gotten complicated not only from the point of view of the private companies looking for capital, but also from the perspective of the sovereigns who are making these investments and are increasingly wanting to make a lot of money and therefore making riskier investments. So this is a world in which the what we, and I will shortly call public-private partnership, has gotten very complicated. And unlike the theory, at least, of the public sector in most countries, which is supposed to be, not often is, but is supposed to be relatively transparent so that you can follow what the government is doing, the government budget is published, and so forth and so on. The world of private investment is deliberately opaque. So it's very hard, actually, to track a lot of this in any systematic way. That is the Saudi U.S. stock portfolio, but obviously they invest all over the world and do other kinds of things and so forth. And it's hard for anyone to track that. In any event, that's what I'm wanting to focus on, is the financialization of state resources. So let's get back to Tilly. So he says, as you can see, that the fact that the third world states were essentially created and imposed in a way that meant that the coercive forces didn't develop the way their European counterparts had, in some ways, it seems to me, has gone even further than when Tilly was writing, and he was writing, you know, the book ends in 1990. And part of that is because of the changing character of the international financial system. So there is a literature, a very small literature. This Anna Leander has written a little bit on this, and so I'm going to borrow from her. But what I'm borrowing essentially is hypotheses. So if you have a situation where controlling capital flows and not developing national taxation is actually how you're thinking about state revenues, okay, what impact does that have on the character of the relationship between the government, if you will, and the population? And are there patterns there? So Leander argues that there are these discernible patterns. The consequence of the move from domestic extraction from taxation to domestic and international revenue growth through transnational capital flows. And of course, you can obviously make domestic investments if you want to. The Saudi investment in the U.S. doesn't prevent it from making investments in Saudi Arabia, which the Public Investment Fund does. But the point is that you're extracting revenues not the way the Europeans extracted revenues through taxation. So she argues that you're bargaining with local strongmen, privatizing and decentralizing. Now, I'm going to go through that. I'm not exactly sure how these mechanisms would work. This is sort of the next research frontier, if you will, if you buy this argument. So anybody who has any suggestions on that, I would welcome them. But I think the interesting thing is that you can sort of see the effects without understanding the causal chain here, suggesting that there's something productive in doing this. So first, controlling international, or better put, transnational capital flows, and much less focused on the development of national taxation. That's what Leander suggests we will see. Obviously, all of you know that the formal tax rates, nominal and real, are exceptionally low in the Middle East and North Africa. This is well known. And the question has always been, you know, how do they stay in power with such low tax rates? I think this is part of the answer to that you don't have to tax if you can extract. And now, there is the old rentier state literature that suggests this dynamic. My argument is that we are way past the rentier state, that there are so many ways in which financialization is permitting governments extracting resources without having to pay any attention to the domestic population at all, that dynamic continues and is being exacerbated. So controlling external financing flows can include remittances, can include oil revenues, can include all sorts of things, but are increasingly including this world of international finance. So the chart is obviously comparative tax rates. You can probably not see that, but I promise you the Middle East is very low. And on the graph, this is various forms of international flows. And the flattest line is official assistance, which hasn't been going very anywhere. And everything else that's increasing is foreign direct investment, remittances, and private debt and portfolio equity. Those are the kinds of things that people are bringing to bear when they're having to pay for things, including, don't forget, their coercive apparatus. So we have something we need to pay for here. And this is how we're mobilizing the resources to do that. I have this is another picture. So I deliberately try and put the Middle East and North Africa in a global context. And here's a good map of tax revenues. And, right in the middle of the map, it's practically empty. That's because right in the middle of the map, there is virtually no taxation. So all the darker you get, the more you're actually taxing. So this is another way of visually presenting the fact that in this part of the world, people don't tax. Could call it tax deserts if you wanted to. Sorry, there's a little bit of a mess in this slide. But the idea is that it's sort of what kinds of, besides sovereign wealth funds, what kinds of things are governments doing, and what do they look like? So in the first instance, the chart with all the bubbles and so forth is the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund and some of the places where they've been investing. And I just sort of thought that would be interesting. It's not just the Saudis, it's everybody who's got them. This is a little bit, now the Saudi example, as I say, was the US portfolio investments. This is much more global, and in some respects, therefore, much more indicative of the kinds of global extent of this kind of these. But other governments and these governments too are developing other ways of trying to mobilize resources. Their inventive use of financial instruments. We've talked about sovereign wealth funds. One of my favorite is Diaspora Bonds. So you get all of your diaspora population to buy bonds at home. These governments will try anything. And it's agile, inventive, modern, and so forth and so on to try and do this kind of thing. You're worrying about me? Thank you. All right, so what I'm trying to convey is the global extent of this and its increasing weight in both the financial system, obviously, but in the landscape in which we're thinking about politics and political development. So once you have seen that, the importance of these kind of transnational flows and the extent to which governments need to try and be capturing that, just as their private sector counterparts need to be capturing that, hence the model that this is essentially a business enterprise. If you're running, a private investment company, if you're running a mutual fund or something like that, you're trying to capture these too. It's the same kind of model. And you're trying to make money yourself, and you're trying to provide dividends to your shareholders. So your conception of your relationship between the responsibilities you have as a public figure, as a government, and your responsibilities as a private investor are very hard to tell apart. So what happens then domestically? So this is now we get into the part where I haven't worked out the mechanisms, so these are hypotheses. But Leander suggests that these patterns of revenue generation require bargaining with local strongmen. Now, I'm not sure exactly why that would be true, but for the fact that they, too, are often capturing financial flows, and so you need to know what they're capturing. You need to try and redeploy it for your purposes. But the existence of such figures is well known. And so some of this is about the crony capitalism. These are other business people. So you need to begin to think of yourself, if you're the ruler, as running a holding company, and these are other parts of your domain, perhaps, in the way holding companies often operate. But they also may be militia leaders and so forth and so on. There's some work being done right now on Libya, on the capture and control of the Libyan Investment Authority, both before and after the Gaddafi regime, which is just fascinating. But that's the kind of, who is in charge of the Libyan Investment Authority? How do they actually move money around, particularly since some of that money is under sanction and everybody in the global financial industry is worried about anti-money laundering provisions and so forth and so on. But the point is that if you're the putative government, you're trying to negotiate with these strong men to capture some of the resources and to control as much as you can. Obviously, the private investment world, the private world of finance makes this extremely difficult because it is deliberately and explicitly opaque. This is not publicly published, so as a ruler, trying to follow the money, if you will, is just as hard for you as it is for all the rest of us when what you're dealing with is your local strongmen. So I think we should begin to look at this a little bit more carefully, what that dynamic actually is. Again, as I say, it's a hypothesis. This is another of Leander's hypotheses, which I think is obviously much easier to, we see privatization all over the place. And just as everybody is trying to sort of financialize themselves, make themselves into assets and so forth, governments are doing that with almost everything they have these days. So this I don't think is that hard to document, but I think sometimes, privatization is actually simply moving assets from the public treasury to the privy purse, and that's often not very transparent either. So there's considerably more work to do on this. But Egypt's government raised a fair amount of money in subscriptions to a set of funds that are ostensibly voluntary. But it's interesting that even if the many of those subscriptions to these funds, for example, for the expansion of the Suez Canal and so forth, were not that voluntary, they still weren't taxes. The Egyptian government is not taxing. It is electing to raise money from its own population through subscriptions to funds. Now, that's a change in conception of the relationship between the government and the population. So how widespread is that? Obviously, I think it's pretty widespread and something we should be paying attention to, but that's part of what the empirical research needs to focus on. Finally, she also argues that there will be decentralization. Again, much discussed. Everybody has been saying decentralization would be really good for this part of the world. All the, international financial institutions, the UN, so forth and so on. Everybody's been saying this for a long time. I think that the rationale for this is little studied. I'm not sure exactly why we're as enthusiastic about decentralization as we are, and I'm not sure how it is linked to financialization. That mechanism piece, I think, I would love to do some more work on that. But it's certainly true that reliance on entrepreneurs might, in fact, require decentralized public-private partnerships. But what we're looking at now is a really reconfigured relationship between capital and coercion. If you're bargaining with local strongmen and privatizing and decentralizing, you're really beginning to mix what is coercion and what is capital. And my favorite of this is the recent decree in Egypt where the Egyptian Armed Forces Land Projects Authority, and as those of you who know Egypt, the Egyptian Armed Forces own most of the land in Egypt. They're now permitted to utilize those as equity in forming joint ventures with domestic and foreign companies. So all of a sudden, the land of Egypt is equity. So then you think, what would Weber say about that? He thought it was territory. He thought it was, geographical territory that would be, managed with coercive forces and so forth and so on, and all of a sudden it's being turned into equity in the same way that young man turned himself into an asset. I just think we need to be thinking about what this means, not only in terms, because that probably, honestly, is not going to produce a lot of joint ventures between the Egyptian Armed Forces and private companies, although it may. But the change in the terms of what land means seems to me to be a fundamental shift that we need to be more alert to than we are. So if armies are now being used to produce revenue, which is in essence what the Egyptian army has been doing for years, then I think we need the distinction between capital and coercion has collapsed. And that's where I think we need to be doing the research. That's the next set of questions. And that's, are you kidding me? Public-private partnerships. It sounds great. We've loved that for years. But this is the facade of what I'm talking about in a way that's a much more fundamental change. It means that the public is being, the public side of this is being hollowed out and reconstructed in terms of the values of a private business enterprise in ways that I don't think we understand at all. What does it mean when your government is basically running a company and sees you at best as a shareholder, possibly as an employee, but conceivably as an irritant, because you're neither a shareholder nor an employee. So what is the relationship between these kinds of governments and their... So the point is, and part of the reason why I have a picture of Modi and talk about Gavi, the vaccine, and so forth and so on, this is global. This is at least global at the global south level, and I actually think you can see some of this beginning to push into why Liz Truss is having so much trouble in the UK right now. But the point is that this different conceptions of what sovereignty means, of what land means, of these sort of fundamental basic building blocks of the modern state system are changing before our very eyes, and I don't think we're doing as much to do that research as we should. So 2 more slides. This is a quote of Mary Calder's that I've always loved about how the deformation of states will be a mirror image of the formation of states, which I think I have just suggested isn't correct. But what I do think is interesting here is that you get patterns in, you're not collecting taxes, so you have to get the money in some other way. So you go back to, now remember when Tilly was talking about capital and said it was finance capital? So maybe that was correct, that early sort of city-state, what Venice was doing in Tilly's European terms. That's what we need to be looking at more. But at the end of the day, you privatize practically everything. So you have private security, and you have, special economic zones, and so forth and so on. Everything becomes basically designed around the prosperity of this private enterprise. And it leaves all the rest of us in a very ambiguous situation. We can't make claims as citizens, because what's a citizen to a company? Maybe we can make claims as shareholders, if we are actually deemed shareholders. But if we're not deemed shareholders, what are we? All of a sudden, we've become the equivalent of stateless. Not because we don't have a state, but because the state itself has disappeared in favor of this private enterprise. Anyway, so I think coercion turned in, capital turned out. I still think that those two mechanisms for understanding how polities organize themselves are very valuable. Obviously, I don't think the way Tilly did it serves our purposes, partly because he didn't finish, and partly because the world has continued to change in ways I think he would have been very interested in. So coercion now turns into domestic repression. Capital is transnationalized and privatized, and coercion is increasingly either an asset or a private security system. So I end with a map from the 1880s portraying an earlier era of this part of the world, described by the mapmaker, a European, as a period of the Arab ascendancy. I'm not quite sure what he meant by that, but what I mean by that is the state system the Europeans fashioned has not always existed, and it will not endure forever. And Tilly was certainly right about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Anderson. Very pertinent topics with sharp observations and arguments. I'm sure we have many questions following this presentation. So please, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Salim. I'm a conflict management student with a background in economics and finance. I would propose that we need to edit Weber's theory on the state, and we need to add monopoly over financial violence, which is being exercised by fiat currency. With the adoption of fiat currency, now we enable the extraction of resources and revenues from the population without even taxing or even being engaged with them. This started in the 1917 through the British, but you know history better than I do. So my question is, do you think fiat currency plays a primary role in this financialization of everything? And do you think blockchain technology plays a role in salvation? Or is it just a utopian dream where, we're going in the same direction anyways? Thanks.
I'm not sure about blockchain and cryptocurrency. It certainly seems to me to be as good a way of mobilizing resources and leaving people in debt as any other mechanism. So I don't think it's a solution. What I think is interesting, though, is that it is disaggregating the capacity of governments to control fiat currency in a way that, is part of this privatization. So that young man, my example was, he invented his own currency in a sense, created a social token, so forth and so on. So no, I don't think it's the solution. but I'm not sure how the fact that it's going to be exacerbating the problems will work themselves out.
Thank you so much for the, I'm here on the left. Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I just have actually I wrote 2 pages of questions, but I have 2 quick ones. One is on alternative explanations to what you mentioned for Tilly. So I'm thinking, well, okay, so the focus of the coercion became internal, mainly because of the military ineffectiveness of many of the states in the region in external campaigns to garner resources there. So Libya had about 7 campaigns in Chad. Egypt had a campaign in Yemen. Syria, maybe that one was a bit successful in Lebanon, relatively speaking. And then Saddam was the last one to get the note in Kuwait, initially in Iran and then in Kuwait. So because of this military ineffectiveness, you look at the relatively weaker side, which is probably unarmed protesters as opposed to professional militaries or insurgent groups. So what do you think of that hypothesis? That's one. And then the second one on implications of what you mentioned. And I think the implications are staggering in terms of empowering the non-state side. ISIS had no state sponsorship, still managed to make some significant military. And then actually from ISIS to Elon Musk. Elon Musk just denied at one point, threatened to deny the Ukrainian military access to satellites, to Starlinks, which forced the state actor, the chief of staff of the Ukrainian military, a military maverick of the class of Patton or Montgomery, to ask him, please get us back the satellites so we can target artillery more accurate, and ISR operations are disrupted, counter-fire operations are disrupted, everything is disrupted. So you see the non-state here, the businessman in the US and the chief of staff in the field. You put the Wagner Group over there, which is fascinating in terms of empowerment, performance in Syria, performance in Libya, very high at a very high level, and then now it's the only military company I know of ever that runs a whole front, the Bakhmut front. Exclusively. No Russian armed forces, no regulars, no LNR or DNR, no militias, basically, just the Wagner Group. In terms of empowerment as well, because of the private finance. So also the implications of that, if you have any others, I'd like to hear about them. Oh, and finally, on the equity of Egypt, that's that's great by itself. But what will be the political and the social implications of that as well?
Okay, thank you. I think your final questions are my questions. In other words, I think we need to be paying much more attention to all of this. It's not sort of, oh, the Wagner Group, those crazy Russians. This is pervasive. The privatization of things that we thought belonged to public authority, and therefore we thought that we should have some capacity to have a say in how the public authority, which was supposed to be responsible to us, whether through formal democratic institutions or some other way, they don't think of themselves as having those responsibilities any longer. So how does that shift that fundamental relationship? And I don't know what the answer is. I think Musk and Starlink are fascinating. I mean, the idea that the way that war is going to be waged is being shaped not entirely, so dramatically by private actors. Just everybody who does security studies need to be doing this, just as everybody who does political economy of development needs to be thinking about finance and taxes and so forth. So I just think those are very good examples of a very pervasive set of developments on the coercion side, and I'm arguing that part of the way you can pay the Wagner Group is by, the privatization of a lot of the financial side of the Russian government. So basically Putin is running a holding company as much as he is doing anything else. He's got to keep the businesses of his sub-CEOs operating And that's not the way we typically think of autocratic government, much less any other. So that's that. On the ineffectiveness of the coercion, I wouldn't necessarily call it ineffective. In some respects, obviously so, but most of the interventions that you described took place in the context of the Cold War, and neither the Americans or the Soviets were going to let things change very much. So, when the Libyans go into Chad, you can put your thumb on that scale without exercising yourself very much. But had it been likely that the Libyans would have been able to take northern Chad and exploit the uranium there, either the Soviets or the Americans would have said no. So de facto, it comes to the same thing. So I do think that and I think Tilly was right, and somebody mentioned this earlier in the weekend. The Europeans didn't have, when they were involved in these processes, didn't have hanging over them a Cold War that manipulated so you would just fight until one of you lost and one of you won. When's the last time that happened? That doesn't happen anymore. So it means you could have the best military apparatus in the world, well-trained, well-equipped, everything. But if the international system doesn't want that border to change, it doesn't. That's what we learned from Biafra. And the other changes in African, the South Sudan and so forth and so on, was blessed by the international community or wouldn't have happened. So that's why you have domestic, a lot of the fighting turns domestic. And as long as what we call the international community, a term I usually don't use and apologize for because there isn't such a thing, but as long as the international players who are using Libya as an arena for proxy competition are happy with that, that war will not end.
Thank you. We're going to take 3 questions together and then
My name is Elias Khalil from the Development Economics program. I think you raised many worries that will keep us late at night for many days. I'm not sure how the title is connected to the subtitle about coercion and so on. So I will limit myself to a comment about the financialization of everything. And I'm going to take a counter view that financialization really started many thousands of years ago, and especially rose with the use of the fraction system with banking. As soon as banks start lending money, they start creating I don't want to call it fictional, maybe fictional or imaginary capital. And they already introduced whatever system we are talking about, some fragility, the issue of fragility with that system, with fractional lending. And a few days ago, the Nobel Prize Committee awarded 3 economists talking about this fragility, monetary fragility. I know the work of 2 of them, Diamond and Debjek, and they're talking about how to avert or to contain, how the state could contain such fragility. Now, the issue is that really the problem with the fragility, there are 2 issues involved. First, there could be informational issues. It becomes so complicated, so fragmented that we really don't know who holds what is really substantive capital as opposed to fictional capital. And in their model, Diamond and Debjek talk about how it is possible to contain it. The other aspect is really in your talk about being worried, very worried about the financialization. From my initial remark about fractional capital, there is nothing wrong with this young man. He has a very handsome picture. to make himself into a token and sell it. There is no worry about it. Really, what worries about it is that if he suddenly collapses and dies from some kind of disease, or he becomes very disfigured or becomes very ugly. So there is an issue here about people want to trade his picture, and it becomes a capital good. But as long as he is, people really maybe forget about him. Just the picture is very appealing, and they could create a fictitious capital. So what is really the worry with such capital is that how is it related to the nuts and bolts of actually producing, actually waking up in the morning, going to the field, planting olive trees, and be able to consume part of it and have a surplus, and with surplus you could invest in sustaining your trees. You don't eat the capital. This was a worry throughout cultures, throughout history. If we study just simple tracts of anthropology, is that how different cultures try to warn people through religion and stuff is not to eat the capital itself. So my short question is that with this financialization, the deep worry is that really we don't know if we are eating our own capital, like the issue of equity in Egypt, etc. Are we really eating our own capital? That's the danger. And really connecting this in a solid way, and in a way that we could be tractable. Is it tractable that the financialization is leading us to really eating our own capital without being aware of it? Thank you.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack, and let me simply say, I think yes, of course, finance has existed for millennia, but I think it has existed in conjunction with a lot of other ways in which human beings conceptualize their relations between them, among themselves, and with political authority, and so forth and so on. And my argument is, in a sense, that partly because of the changing technology, it is now eating away at other ways that we conceptualize how political authority works, for example, and so forth. So I don't think there's anything wrong with any of you deciding that you're going to financialize yourselves and sell shares and so forth and so on. And we are going to take a risk. Maybe you're going to, I'm not going to get the return on my investment. That's certainly possible. But I think what worries me is that depending on how the states are thinking about citizens, that ultimately becomes the value of a person. And I think that's different. So if, from the point of view of the political authorities, you're a citizen, they have responsibilities to you and you have claims on them, that if you're an asset, they don't and you don't. So if this was simply, kind of epiphenomenal, it was happening and, there was a Wagner, but I think this is becoming so pervasive and so much the way governments conceive of their responsibilities that I think we need to see, so they don't have to tax. They don't, they just, that's what some of it I wouldn't necessarily worry about. I think, people can monetize themselves if they want to, and I don't care about that. It's more the implications for social life and political life that I think are, and again, I think it's probably true that I think this is a somewhat worrisome, prospect. But many, many people are very excited about it. There's a kind of techno-optimism in a lot of the regimes that are doing this that I don't share, but I think we also need to acknowledge that there's a sort of, we can beat the world this way. This is, this is how we're going to have prosperity and everybody will benefit from prosperity and all that sort of stuff. So it's not necessarily, I tend to be skeptical about that. So I tend on the gloomy side, if you will. But I think we ought to acknowledge and also explore the sources of that techno-optimism, that enthusiasm for this new way of conceiving, what government is supposed to do and so forth.
Okay, I'm going to take 3 questions together for the sake of time, and then possibly you answer the 3, just in case there is some overlap. And because we have 10 minutes left, and I have 3 questions, Professor Radwan, Professor Abdulwahab, and then...
Thank you, Dr. Amal. My questions, how the concept of gentrification from the urban studies apply into your concept, because we have seen that in Lebanon, in the Solidaire, the development of the city center, the same thing in Dubai, Doha, and in other cities, which means money in, people out, the development of the city center. And we saw that now in Egypt. I think that the concept of gentrification exactly can be applicable into your argument. Thank you.
Yes, I think economy is not my thing, so I am more puzzled now than I was at the beginning. My understanding is that capitalism, whether in the Marxian narratives or generally as a phenomenon, presupposes that there are limits for coercion, that in order for finance to function, for economy to function, the capitalists should have some freedom. And this makes, has I think in Tilly's arguments and others, that now the coercion became dependent on finance. The more your capitalists become richer, the more you can tax, the more you can be stronger as a state. So there has always been this this interaction between coercion and finance, but with finance at the thing, the goose which lays the eggs, so the golden eggs. So you can, if you kill it, you won't have that. So that limited the coercion. And we have seen that in the Soviet Union and other systems which tried to rely on coercion more, they collapsed as economies. So what are you now saying? Are you saying that what Marxism has been saying about capital, that capital has become more independent and the coercion is subservient to it, or are you saying something more? A related question, also the neoliberalism has come because the cost of the public sector has become so high in countries like UK that the government found that it could not afford it anymore. Because also there is here an interaction between taxation and the welfare. The government had to sustain a big health service, pay doctors and pay those, and everybody uses it, but at the same time it has to tax others for getting this. So if they tax less, they have now come up with this neoliberalism in that privatize everything. And this may hope that the economy, the capitalist system, will then do its work. Is that what I am right about or not? Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. A question from a Lebanese entrenched in corruption. Help me please understand, what is the difference between this, what you explained, and the corrupt misappropriation of public funds or any fund in corrupt countries like mine? So what if I'm a ruler and I make it my own, and like most Arab leaders have done, So what's the difference between this and the financialization of everything? And perhaps what could help me understand is, how do those other people, the civilized ones like in Norway, how does a sovereign fund in Norway function? Yani, how is it different from what goes in the pocket of my horrible rulers? Thank you.
I'm going to hear from a sociologist, and then we'll see. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this great lecture. I was just wondering, so a lot has been said about the changing relationship between the state and its citizens in democratic contexts. You know, in the UK, there's extensive talk about conditionality, welfare states turning to workfare states, the increasing futility of trade unions, etc. And all of these discussions talk about the changing understanding of what it means to be a citizen. And any form of activism against these changes always comes from a place of claiming something that citizens feel like they are losing, that their grandparents had after the Second World War. Could you comment on how resistance to the effects of neoliberalization and financialization on our conception of citizenship differs in a context that does not have established democracies, in a context where there's ongoing democratization, but there isn't really, there aren't established democracies. Thank you.
Whew. Okay. Gentrification is a perfect example, in my view, of the privatization piece. So you basically have private enclaves developed to serve the community that is part of this financial elite. And some of the financial elite do other things, include serve in the government, but it's basically the wealthy, and the wealth is coming from finance. The wealth is not coming from the real economy, okay? And you see them, so you see special economic zones all over the region. You see gated communities all over the region. You see universities that are serving those families all over the region. So you see a almost increasingly sort of self-contained, and you see it in other parts of the world too, but I'm talking about here because it's what I've seen, you know, directly. But you can basically take a helicopter now and fly over vast swaths of people without ever interacting with them. So I think that that's a version of what I'm talking about. And that gets to, well, I'll get to it then. So yes, the fiscal crisis of the state in Europe and then in the rest of the world contributed to and coincided with the development of a neoliberal version of slimming down the state. The alternative would have been to tax more heavily, which a few Scandinavian countries have tried. But I would argue that the fiscal crisis of the state was both real and an excuse for a new way of doing things. So rather than say, remarkably, Gorbachev and Thatcher and Reagan all thought at the same time that their respective states needed to be slimmed down, that was an ideological shift. It was not simply a matter of but you're right, all of them said, we can't afford what we're doing. And therefore we have to privatize some of what we do, but look how low taxes have gone, especially in the United States. You could double the tax rate in the United States and therefore double public services of various kinds. But that's not part of the conversation, in part because this financial elite that I was talking about in the United States, as in this region and so forth and so on, is just not prepared to entertain that as an alternative vision of the relationship between the public sector and the public. In part because they're not interested in the public sphere. They're interested in this model that I'm calling the financialization of everything, where they're making money, where the private, their relationships with other people, with other institutions and so forth and so on, are modeled on a private as opposed to a public sphere. We can, I think that's at least partly what you were getting at. If you think you have a state that you can misappropriate resources from, then you have corruption. If you think at some level that this belongs to, I am the CEO, then you don't. So it's partly the language we use in characterizing the behavior. But if I'm running a company and I can pay dividends to my shareholders, and I can sell shares to shareholders, and I can expect to make a profit, the fact that I'm having to do that in part through a vehicle which some people think was originally designed for public purposes, that's a cost of doing business. But I'm fundamentally doing business.
But to whom is the CEO accountable?
Their board of directors. So I think Lebanon is a really interesting example because, of course, by the time you had it run by, by the time the Civil War ended and you had the Hariri enterprise come in, it became an enterprise, in my view. So for people who think Lebanon is supposed to be a state with a government and a public sector and a public sphere and so forth and so on, it looks like there's something wrong. That's corruption. You could, though, it's sort of like the rabbit and the duck. Just look at it a little differently. It works pretty well, actually, if you're looking at it from that perspective. Now, the problem with this, and the reason why I'm not a there are many reasons why, is Lebanon shows us, as I think a number of other countries like this show us, if you're designing your enterprise for the purposes of profit, so forth, there are lots of people in the world that don't fit into the picture. They're not shareholders, they're not customers, they're not employees. So that's what my fundamental, so if I'm worrying about something, that's what I'm worrying about. And it's interesting because the language of people who are talking about the move of Egypt's capital from Cairo to the new administrative capital keep talking about the people who are left behind. And to me, that conveys something important about what's happening in the world, actually. And that gets to this question about the United States. One of the things that these trends that I've described is associated with is, of course, growing inequality. Because you get this wealthy elite that this works for them. And then you get the people who are either conscious of or intuiting that they're being left behind, that it's not working for them. Their children don't have as good prospects, whatever the rhetoric is. They just, I think that's global. I don't think it's that much different in autocracies and democracies. And I think it is contributing to the authoritarianization of democracies, actually, because if there's nothing you're going to do about it, then who needs those erstwhile citizens anyway? So that's the kind of gloomy part of it. I think the interesting thing is that I think it's hard to imagine how this system is going to work with nothing trickling down. And right now, I think people in this world of finance are having so much fun, making so much money, and then saying, well, I'll give some money to Starlink and help the Ukrainians, or I'll be Bill Gates and help with the vaccines. And, I'm a good person. I'm giving things away that belong to me. For a while, that will sort of stave off the concern that there's something wrong with this picture. But I think the flaw, and I don't think the flaw is actually the fragility, honestly. I mean, there's an interesting debate about whether Bernanke and company should have gotten that Nobel, in part because they're working so much within the system that they see this as, a flaw that can be fixed. It's not a flaw, it's a bug, as we say, or it's I think this is something, it's a feature. The problem isn't that it's fragile. The problem is actually is that it's not very fragile. And that as you see this growing inequality, you're going to have to figure out some way to actually recycle a lot more of the revenues into the rest who actually don't fit into how the system works. But anyway, that's...
I apologize. I can't take more questions. We're out of time. Thank you so much, Professor Anderson, for such a fascinating presentation. And although some things look terrifying, not knowing where we're heading to with these issues, please join me in thanking Professor Anderson. Thank you.